I've been doing a lot of cleanup work on the Queuebase code base because now that it's in production, I want a more maintainable and scalable architecture. So we're going to look here at this API endpoint that I wrote, for example. And I wrote this to try and get this app out the door faster. So I'm not really too proud of what's in here, and hence why I'm refactoring. So right off the bat, we are pulling Q stash in from upstash. We're doing some checks for our parameters and stuff, and this is well and good up to this point. We're validating our input, and that's cool. But it's usually at this point you would hand the backend logic off to something like a service or a use case or whatever. You don't want to be doing data access in your controller. And, well, it's kind of exactly what I'm doing here. So I'm doing some queries. I'm calling Q stash. I'm doing a bunch of updates in here, some inserts, some really not great stuff that really the controller should not be responsible for. And quite frankly, this logic doesn't need to be in a controller at all. So this route is actually on my API/platform path, and this was a bunch of endpoints that I just threw together to get something working. This really should have been done in a server component, with a server action. There's really no need for this folder to exist, and quite frankly, my TRPC routes either. I feel like this should all be done on the server with server components and server actions. This V1 route is actually fine to have as an API route because this is how the SDK actually interacts with Queuebase. It's calling these endpoints, so this is totally fine. This needs a little bit of cleanup still, like, for example, this should, again, not be doing database stuff in here. This should be calling a use case of some kind, but this is a little bit easier to clean up and a little bit less egregious than some of the stuff that I wrote in my internal routes. So what I've been doing, and this has been inspired by some of WebDev Cody's videos, is been refactoring my code base into a clean architecture type format, where essentially you have a use case, which is your business logic, and you have a data access layer, which does all of your data fetching, and you just keep those things separate. But I took a slightly different approach. When I'm at work, we tend to do a more feature-driven, more microservice style approach. So usually what you'll see is you'll have a folder for something like data access, right? And then underneath here, you would have like cron.ts, right? Environment.ts. And then this would contain all of your methods for working with the database for these different entities. I take the inversion of that where, I have a folder under my modules, or I have some projects where I call it features, right? So this is a feature. And then I would say, I have a /cron route. And then in here, right, then I would have data access.ts. I like this a little bit more because it gives me a very clear separation of where features go, as opposed to this high level folder approach where I would have, all of my entities laid out in there. With this, I can clearly see what's where. And as a project grows, having things broken out by feature, I've found is a little bit more of a nicer way to organize things. So at the top layer in this architecture, we have the presentation, right? And the presentation would consist of the UI. It is API endpoints. It is server actions, server components. Anywhere where we're either fetching data or modifying data, that's presentation, right? So the presentation is then interacting with a use case. And a use case represents an action that can be taken within the application. So I have a use case, for example, for creating a new cron job, right? So that use case is one specific action that can be taken within the application. So my use cases then, if this is my business logic, interacts with my repositories and services. And having a service layer for some things might be overkill, and it can also be super helpful for other things. So I have repos and services. So my repository layer is essentially describing how my database is interacted with, right? So I'm using Drizzle as my ORM for this application. So my repository layer just has a bunch of methods that call Drizzle. So I have create methods in there, update methods in there, delete methods in there, right, for my entities. And then in the service layer, this is where things get a little bit that don't fall. This is for things that don't really fall neatly into like the crud of a repository. So this would be things like calling Upstash to schedule a new job or to push a message to Upstash, right? Or maybe I have some extra business logic that I need from in here before I can actually make the call to a repository to do something, right? So I generally look at a use case as an action or a single event that a user can do within the app, and a use case can interact with repositories and services. The use case generally shouldn't care about how things are implemented. It more so just cares about doing the thing, right? So if I have a create cron job use case, then I don't care about how that job is created and saved. I'm just going to call the method in the repository. I don't care about the scheduling mechanism. I'm just going to call a service to schedule it to wherever that be, whether that's Upstash or should I move to SQS or some other queuing system. The use case doesn't care about where that is. It just knows it needs to do it. The actual implementation is abstracted from it. It's hidden. So if we come back into the code base now, I kind of have this laid out, and I'm still playing with the actual naming and folder structure a little bit, but I think for the most part, this is what I like. So at that high level, we have our use cases, right? And our first use case, this is probably a pretty good one to look at, is get cron jobs for environment. So in Queuebase, we have the idea of environments or branches where you can hook up your app to a different environment and not impact any of the jobs running on your main production sites. So this method or this use case will get all of the cron jobs for a given environment. And every environment has a UID or a slug that we're showing in the URL because we're using auto increment IDs internally. I want it to have a UID to show publicly. So this method is actually a part of the environment repository. I have to fix this a little bit. It's just a standalone method right now. But essentially, it fetches the environment based on that slug. So if we have it, cool. If we don't have it, we're going to throw an error that says, hey, this isn't here, right? We don't want to continue to fetch on something that isn't there, right? So then I have my cron service, which fetches the job or fetches all the cron jobs for that environment by calling this method in my repository, right? And so you see here in my repository, this is where I'm actually doing the lookup. Now, does this need to be in its own service? No, probably not, to be honest. This is really simple logic. I think it would be okay to just call the repository directly from the use case here. I just put it in here for reasons. Now, there's might be other parts in here, right? So for example, let's say I have to look up if a cron job exists in Upstash, right? That's not really a data access thing. That would go in here, right? And then I would call my Upstash service to actually check to see if there's a schedule, right? So going between all of these layers are DTOs. And DTO stands for Data Transfer Object, And it essentially is we get an object back from here, right? Like this would be a DTO. And then we can also have a DTO going from use cases back to the presentation layer. And this really is helpful for a number of reasons. One is I can define models at this level, right? And have an expected type output in here that I can then use to perform other actions, right? So if I have a type for a cron job, I can fetch it here, format it how I want, and send it back to the use case. Now, let's say for a listing, I have a bunch of fields that I really don't want to show in the UI. I could just create another DTO at this layer here at this level, format it, and then return that new object back to the UI, right? So DTOs just allow you to move objects around without exposing any details, too much information, too little information. It's just a nice way of interacting with the system. So back inside the code base again, I have this cron job DTO where I have its ID, its name. Hello, cat. Dude, every single video, I swear. So in my DTOs file, I have this cron job DTO that I am using in my front end as a prop type. And essentially, this is saying this is the expected output from wherever we get this data from, right? So from this use case, I'm expecting it to be in this format so I can show it in my table. Now, some of these other folders might have a file called entities, and entities defines the repository service mapping to the use case, right? So it's might have similar fields and properties, but the domain that they live in is different. And that's the key here. The other file that I have in here is called validation. And this is where I put all of my Zod schemas. So I have my create cron, my update cron, and this is essentially just my schema to validate my input coming in and my type that I can then pass to my use case. So I can define in here whatever I want for whatever inputs for a use case I want. So this right now is kind of copied one-to-one, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. We do have a couple other properties on the update schema, but usually what I like to do for create is define all of the fields that I need to create and give error messages if they're not there. What I usually do for update is expose all of the properties that could be updated and make them optional. And that lets me do things like partial updates so that I'm not rewriting values to the database that don't necessarily need to be written every single time. But that's a small, minor thing that I'll get around to fixing here at some point. It's not super important for right now. So you can see this in action in the Queuebase dashboard. So I'm in my demo project, I'm on my development branch, and I have a single cron job in here. And that is calling this get cron jobs for end use case, right? So here's that page. I'm fetching on the server, passing in my environment ID, right? That slug that I have in my URL. And then I'm just passing that to my client page where, oh, there's that DTO I was showing you earlier. And I'm actually showing a table with that, right? So create and edit are similar stories, right? So instead of calling it directly, though, in the page, right? Because you see I'm calling this use case directly in the component, which is okay for this because this is a get. I'm just calling them in my actions, right? So I'm going to try and create a cron job. I have my input here. There's that validation schema. And then if that works, just revalidate the path. So obviously I still have some cleaning up to do. Like I showed earlier, this endpoint is kind of a mess and it can be a server action. So still working through some of that, but overall I'm really happy with this structure. It is still subject to change because again, I'm not sure, if maybe I need an entities file, right, that represents the DTO from the repository/service layer back to the use case layer just to keep that encapsulated. But for the most part, this has been a lot nicer of an architecture to work in than trying to just stuff everything inside a controller. This is a lot more scalable, it's a lot cleaner, and it really would help if somebody else were to join this project. Hey, this is where everything is at, right? It just keeps a nice separation of concerns between your presentation, your actual business, domain, use cases, and then anything else you might need interacting with external services like other APIs, databases, caching, all that kind of stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, make sure you give it a like. And if you want to keep seeing more content like this, make sure you subscribe. I'm going to be doing a lot more just showing Next.js and patterns and software development stuff. So you definitely aren't going to want to miss it. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.